All right, I will say good morning. Good morning. Let us begin. I don't think there's any. I don't think there's any in it anyway. So, no, it's right. It's not. It's okay. Sorry, Menachos, it's good. All right, we'll say good morning. Good morning. Good morning. Schus, Baruch Hashem, to be back with all of you. Begin by thanking, first of all, Rabbi Yehuda Newberger, who gave shir while I was away for a couple of days, and to thank Jeremy Lassen, who was coordinating the tech piece here, Maishi Abramson, who was helping to coordinate the tech piece even when he was not here. And again, let's begin by thanking all of our sponsors. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Shvat, Haba Alinu Latova, Mel and Karen Ram, in honor of the entire Kehila, entire Daf, entire Chevra. A week of learning sponsors, Nathan and Beth Adler, in memory of Beth's father, Tzvi and Kalman Zichrono Livracha, on the occasion of his first yard site, and by our Chaver, Reb Zevi Daniel, who, Baruch Hashem, is also to welcome back. Otherwise, we should be zocheh to join you in Eretz Yisrael. With gratitude to David Schwartz for making sure that Zevi is awake every day at 12:30 p.m. Israel time for Daf Yomi. That is tremendous, Mesiras Nefesh. That's going to be in the Sima Shas video. And with special gratitude to the entire pit crew, Maishi and Jeremy, for enabling me, Zevi speaking, and so many to feel part of the Chabura, even from 6,000 miles away. Incredible. Zevi, welcome back. It's such a schus always to see your beautiful Hadras Panim. And Halva Shuvizochem Eretz Hashem to join you in Eretz Yisrael B'Karov. All right, with that, let us begin. Today's daf is Chof Gimel, and what a daf it is. Gimel Maseches Menachos. We are picking up in Eretz Hashem. Oh, you know what? I realized I left off on Chav Beis and Beis. 3 lines are from the bottom. Tanan. Rabbi Yehuda says as follows. So remember again, we had an interesting machlokes, just to reorient ourselves for a moment. We had an interesting machlokes on Chav Beis Amud Aleph 22a in the Mishnah about what happens if a chometz gets mixed in with another chometz, another mincha. So again, without getting into all the specifics of that machlokes, again, we had a machlokes between Rabbi Yehuda and the Rabbanon. Tanakama holds pretty much everything goes up on the Mizbeach, you're good to go. And once everything goes up on the Mizbeach, it's all burnt together, and therefore there's absolutely no problem. Rabbi Yehuda, on the other hand, felt that halacha l'maisa, when a kamitza gets mixed in with other items that are like items, that's fine. But when it gets mixed in where there is a different oil-flour ratio, then we have an issue. What's the issue? The issue is that the kamitza may go ahead and absorb more oil or lose some of its oil, and as a result, that would invalidate the kamitza. So, the Gemara now says as follows. Tonight, Rabbi Yehuda says as follows: B'minchas koin Mashiach u'minchas nesachem psula. It's 22b's, 2 lines up from the bottom. So Rabbi Yehuda said in the Mishnah that halacha l'maisa, if the kamitza ends up getting mixed in with the mincha of a kohen gadol or mincha of nesachim, which have greater amounts of oil, ultimately, again, the kamitza is pasul. Why? Shizu b'lilasa ava v'zu b'lilasa raka. Very simple, because a regular mincha has a thicker consistency, and these other menachos have a more liquidy consistency. Vehein bolos zumizu, and ultimately, again, they will end up absorbing one from the other, which will invalidate the kamitza. Says the Gemara, v'chi bolos zumizu my havi. But still, at the end of the day, even if they absorb from each other, so what? The Gemara says my havi min b'minohu. This also was the end of yesterday's daf. Rabbi Yehuda says min b'mino, and min b'mino, when you have a mixture of like items, ultimately, again, it is not bottle. Amar Rava says kasav Rabbi Yehuda holds. We'll say top of Chav Gimel 23a. Kasav Rabbi Yehuda. So Rabbi Yehuda holds kol shu min b'mino v'davar acher. Whenever you have, we'll say 2 like items and what we'll call a foreign item. So min b'mino, 2 like items v'davar acher, and something else. Now, just to understand what everything is in this mixture, Rashi says over here, type Rashi, min b'mino is shemen v'shemen. So you have oil and oil mixed together, right? V'davar acher. And in this case over here, the davar acher, the other item is considered to be flour. So what do you do when you have min b'mino v'davar acher? So the Gemara says very simple, silek esmino, kimi she'eno. Remove the mino, so remove the oil, as if it's not there. And if that's the case, Rabbi say, if you remove the mino, then what do you have? You have min b'she'eno mino, 2 dissimilar items. Now again, when you have 2 dissimilar items, that's when there is the possibility for bidul. So the Gemara says, if that's the case, remove the mino, remove the oil as if it's not there. The she'eno mino, rabba alav umevatlo. And then the dissimilar item, in this case that'll be the flour, will ultimately come and be mevatel, the other item. That's why according to Rabbi Yehuda holds this unique halacha in Hilchos Taroves. And therefore, halacha l'maisa, he holds that it is a problem when the regular kmitza gets mixed in with these other menachos. Okay, incredible. Let's go back there. Itmar, kometz de minchas chote sheshamno. So we'll say this is an interesting case. So if you remember again, there are two, generally a mincha. A mincha has oil in it, right? The mincha generally has three parts. What are the three parts? Soles flour, shemen oil, and levona frankincense. Now, what we've just seen before is that different menachos have different oil-flour ratios. However, remember there are two menachos of note. Those two menachos of note are the minchas chote, the sinner's mincha, and the sota's mincha. What's unique about those two? No oil at all. Okay, so now watch the following case. Kometz the minchas chote sheshamno. What happens if the kometz of a sinner's mincha absorbed oil? Now Rashi says over here, sheshamno shenasan alav shemen la'achar shekamso. So here's the case. The case is where I took the kamitza of the sinner's mincha. So I have the kamitza. After the kamitza was taken, now oil was added to the kamitza. So the shaila is, what does that do to the kamitza? So Rabbi Yochanan says pasul. Rabbi Yochanan says it's pasul, right? Because after all, it makes a lot of sense. The kmitza of a minchas chote is not supposed to have oil. Reish Lakish Amar hu atzmo mishachshecho b'shiyarei halug ma'aleos. Okay, so we'll say this is a very strange statement. Reish Lakish says no, this is good. Why? Because halacha l'maisa, under normal circumstances, you would take the kmitza, smear it against the inside of the kli in order for it to absorb oil. Which is very interesting. Rashi says over here, hu atzmo, last of the wide lines on top, hu atzmo, kilomar, tchilas mitzvah, sheyipash b'shenu lekomes b'shirei mincha, echa min halugim v'chol shekein dim shamno kasher. So Reish Lakish seems to indicate that halacha l'maisa, what it sounds like over here, is that l'chatchila, you should go ahead and take the kmitza, and kind of like smear it in oil after the kmitza was taken. So if that's what you're supposed to do lechatchila, then alachas kama v'kama, if it ends up going ahead and absorbing oil, that it's going to be totally fine. Gemara says, what? Reish Lakish, what are you talking about? V'haksiv lo yasim ala Hashem v'lo yitin ala levona. How can you say that you're supposed to lechatchila put oil in the kmitza of the minchas chote when the Torah itself explicitly says that halacha l'maisa, we don't put oil in the minchas chote? To which the Gemara says, no, hahu shelo yikavel shemen kechavroseh. No, what the Torah means when it says that is that a minchas chote is not supposed to have oil like its friends. In other words, I will say the same way that a regular mincha. What happens with the regular mincha? Regular mincha has. Remember, also we learned this already. I think middle of last week. That oil is really applied at three different intervals. Right? When is oil applied? Number one, oil is put in the klisharis before the flour. That's number one. Number two, then oil is added to the flour, and then number three, the rest of the lug is added in afterwards as well, into the flour as well. So the Gemara says like this. Reish Lakish holds that in general the halacha is as follows. The halacha follows like this, that in general, with a minchas chote, you will not introduce oil the same way that you introduce it by other menachos. That's clear. That's clear. However, after the kmitza is taken, you add some oil to the kmitza. Very interesting idea. Really, really novel ruling over here. Rabbi Yochanan is a Reish Lakish. Charev shenis arev bebalo. Okay, so let's listen to this case. Rabbi Yochanan asked the following question Reish Lakish. He says, if you have a dry mincha that gets mixed in with a moist mincha. Okay, so again, this could be bepashtos. What this sounds like over here, we have two dry menachos, right? What are our two dry menachos? Again, the sinner's mincha, the sota's mincha. That's bepashtos. So now I have a dry mincha that gets mixed in with a moist mincha. What's the halacha? Yakriv. You could offer it all up. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Yehuda says, lo yakrif. Rabbi Yehuda says, no, you can't offer it up. Okay, so now the Gemara says, what's this case? My love comments the minchas chote, the arev the comments the minchas nedava. are we not talking about a case of where the komets of a minchas chote, that's the dry mincha, right? Komets of a minchas chote gets mixed in with stam, a minchas nedava. Is that not the case that we're talking about over here? So we'll say that's the case of dry that gets mixed in together with moist. The Gemara says, no, lo, minchas parim ve'elim beminchas kvasim. No, the Gemara says, no, that's not the case. The case ultimately, again, is a case of minchas parim ve'elim, that gets, which is literally, again, literally translated the mincha of cows and rams, that gets mixed in with the mincha of sheep. Now, we'll say, now these are examples of menachos where they both have oil, they both have flour, but the ratios of oil and flour are different from mincha to mincha. So it calls one of them dry, calls one of them moist, because one of them has more oil, one of them has less oil. To which the Gemara says, but if that's the case, v'ha behedja katanila, but we actually learned that explicitly already, minchas parim ve'elim beminchas kvasim. If you have the mincha of parim and elim that gets mixed in with the mincha of kvasim, the charev shenis arvev bebadel, or a dry mincha that gets mixed in with a moist mincha, yakriv. You could offer it all up. Rabbi Yehuda Amar lo yakriv. Rabbi Yehuda says you can't offer it up. So we already learned this already. To which the Gemara says, you're right. Perush shekam la. At the end of the day, the Gemara is just explaining now that previous case. That's all that's happening over here. Just going ahead and giving a little bit more definition to that case. What's the case ultimately again of a dry mincha that gets mixed in with a moist mincha? Thank you. Right? Thank you so much. That gets mixed in with a moist mincha. Ultimately, again, this is a case not of a minchas chote. This is a case not of a minchas chote that gets mixed in with a regular mincha, but rather the case of a mincha with less oil that gets mixed in with a mincha of more oil. Okay, incredible. Incredible. I will say, just by the way, so what happens, what is the halacha in the event that you end up mixing in oil with a minchas chote or a minchas sota? So the Rambam paskins that we pass like Rabbi Yochanan. That is possible. That is possible. So these two menachos, namely again, a sinner's mincha and a sota's mincha, these two menachos have no shaychus to oil. And if you end up introducing oil into the mincha, it actually invalidates it. Whether you introduce it into the klishares with the flour, or you introduce the oil into the kmitza, whatever it is, if you introduce oil into this carbon, the carbon is fundamentally invalid. That's why paskin halacha l'maisa. Good. Let's go back. They're both a really interesting case here. Bayrava. Komet shemitza shmano agabe eitzim mahu. So Rabbi say this is a very interesting case over here. Let's say you have a kometz, right? Now again, Rabbi say, remember, in a typical case, as you just mentioned before, you put step 1, klisharis, right? Step 2, oil in the klisharis. Step 3, introduce flour into the oil. Step 4, introduce more oil. Step 5, Levona, although again, that may or may not be step 5, it could be 5 or 6. And then 6, pour in the rest of the oil. Let's say now you took the kmitza. Right, so b'pashtos, when you take the kmitza, now you have the flour and the oil mixture in your hand. Let's say you squeeze the oil out of the kmitza. Squeeze it out, okay? So now the oil itself lands on the wood that is going to be burnt on the mizbeach. Remember again, because the kometz, right, the kometz burnt on the mizbeach. So what I did over here is I went ahead and I squeezed the oil out of the kmitza onto the wood. Now, again, I'm about to say, now what's novel about this? So remember, so now you say, well, my kmitza is deficient. Well, it's not totally deficient, because where's the kmitza going to go to? Where's the kmitza going? Where's it going? It's going on the wood. So Meretz Hashem, it is going to be reunited with its oil. Right, Jess? It's going to happen when everything is placed together on the wood itself. So that's the shayla. Kometz shemitza shmano agabe eitzim mahu. If you go ahead, if you look at Rashi over here, agabe eitzim, so I have the kometz with the oil. I squeeze the kometz out of the oil itself. And then I subsequently place the kmitza on the wood. So is that a kosher kmitza or not? So the mahu, hibure olin ka'olin damu, olav ka'olin damu. So we'll say, so do we say, essentially everything that goes on the mizbeach is considered to be connected, right? That literally again, chiburi olin ka'olin damu. When you are connected to something else, that if you're all going on the same mizbeach, right? You're all being offered up in the same way. You're connected, or not? So that's the shaila. Since the oil is on the wood, the kamitz is going to end up on the wood. Do we say that halacha lamaisa, again, everything is considered to be connected or not? Look at Rashi. Rashi says, mahu. Rashi's, if you see Tosas like komets, it's right across them, pretty much right across from them, Rashi. Mahu. Mi havi chaser komets o lo. Do we say that the komets is deficient or not? Mi amrinan, chibure olin, mashu mechaber Hashem lekomets, shechazer benasan hakomets ala eitzim. So both say it's a good shayla. It's fascinating shayla. So again, one more time, I have the kamitz with the oil, I squeeze out the oil onto the wood. Now, not just any wood. Remember again, this is the wood that's going to be used on the pyre, on the mizbeach. So now both say the shayla just is the kamitz apostle? Because hey, you've separated out the oil. Or do I say no, since everything is going back to the same place, both the oil and the kamitz are both going to be on the wood, therefore halacha and they're going to be offered up together, that they are considered to be connected. To which the Gemara says, is this not the same case, Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish? What did Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish say? Here we go. Okay, so we'll say, so a bit of context over here. A bit of context. This is talking about, again, halacha l'maisa, the prohibition of shchutei chutz, or I should say of krovei chutz. If you offer up a carbon outside of the Beis HaMikdash, if you do that, you are only in violation if you offer up a kezayis of sacrificial matter. So here's the shaila. Let's say you offer up a piece of sacrificial meat. Now, the meat itself, you don't have a kezayis of meat, but when you combine the bone with the meat, you have a collective kezayis. A collective kezayis. So, amayla ever she'ein bo kezayis, ve'etzem mashlimo lekezayis. So I go ahead, I put a limb that doesn't have a kezayis, and the bone itself, mashlimo, brings it to completion of kezayis. I'm sorry. So the piece of meat itself doesn't have a kizayis. But then when I combine the volume of the bone, mashlimo lekizayis. So what is the halacha? Rabbi Yochanan says chayiv. Rabbi Yochanan says you chayiv. Reish Lakish amar pater. Reish Lakish says you're pater. Now both say. Now the Gemara assumes what's the point of contention over here? Here it is. Rabbi Yochanan amar chayiv. Chibure olin ka'olin damu. Rabbi Yochanan says you're chayiv. Why? Because anything that essentially goes on the mizbeach together is considered to be connected. So since in a normal circumstance, what are you putting on the mizbeach? You're putting the meat and you're putting the bone. That combines for the shear. There, and therefore, going to say, just keep this in mind. Same thing. What the pashtos? What would Rabbi Yochanan hold? Rabbi Yochanan would therefore hold that even if you squeeze the oil out of the kamitza, at the end of the day, since everything is going on the same piece, so what is all going to be burned together? Therefore, it's considered to be like one unit. Reish Lakish amar pater. Reish Lakish says you're pater. Why? Chibure olin lav ka'olin dam. Reish Lakish says no. Just because they're going on the mizbeach does not necessarily combine them into one cohesive unit. Very interesting. To which the Gemara says no, not necessarily. Tiboy Rabbi Yochanan, Tiboy Reish Lakish. The truth is the shaila is still both on Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. How so? Tiboy Rabbi Yochanan, because according to Rabbi Yochanan, Ad kan lo kam Rabbi Yochanan hasam ela be'etzem demina debasarhu. It's different. Maybe Rabbi Yochanan holds that the bone could complete the shear of kezayis for the meat. Why? Because we both say a bone and the meat are the same thing, right? They're both called the limb, the sacrificial limb of the animal. It's one entity. Aval hai the lav demina de kometzulo. But oil and flour are not the same min. As much as they're all part of the same carbon, they're not the same thing, and therefore maybe halacha l'maisa, it would not work. In other words, it would not be considered to be one combined entity. The other possibility is afil Reish Lakish lo ka'amar ela be'etzem debar mifrashu v'parish lab mitzvah lahadure. Furthermore, again, or even according to Reish Lakish, who says that the meat and the bone do not combine to form the kizayis. Maybe that's because they're both say, listen to this. Remember, both say back to our Zvachim days, we spoke about poppage, right? That if part of the sacrifice, part of the carbon pops off the mizbeach, right, because of the fire, like it can pop off, do you have to put it back on or not? So interestingly enough, a bone, you don't have to put back on. So maybe that's why Reish Lakish holds that the etzem, the bone, doesn't combine with the meat to form the kizayis, because if the bone were to fall off, to pop off the mizbeach, you wouldn't be obligated to put it back on. Aval shemen, the lav bar mefarishu, but ultimately, again, shemen, which first of all doesn't normally pop off, right? Halacha l'maisa, again, maybe it is considered to be one entity, right? The Gemara says, Those distinction, therefore teku. So the Gemara leaves this as an open-ended question. So again, just to understand what happened over here. Rava asked the Shaila. What was Rava's Shaila? It was in the event that you squeeze the oil out of the komets onto the wood of the Mizbeach, and then you're subsequently going to put the komets on the Mizbeach. Is the mincha kasha or not? What's the shaila? The shaila is, do we say that since they're going to be both put on the same place on the mizbeach, that they're considered to be connected, or do we say that no, presently they're disconnected, and therefore the carbon is invalid? The Gemara wanted to try to align this with the same machlokes Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish about does a bone combine with sacrificial meat for the requisite shear of kizayis for shchutei chutz? To which the Gemara essentially says the machloksim don't align. That's bottom line. Two very interesting machlokes, but they do not align. How do we pass in halacha l'maisa? So we'll say, interestingly enough, the Rambam paskins over here like Rabbi Huda, that halacha l'maisa, that like the first, well, it doesn't, no, like the first opinion as quoted by Rava, that halacha l'maisa, if you go ahead and you squeeze out the oil on the mizbeach, the carbon mincha is still kosher. Because since everything ultimately again is going on the mizbeach together, therefore halacha l'maisa they're considered to be connected. Okay, incredible. We'll say Mishnah. Okay, so this is a very interesting case here. You have two menachos. Now, in both of these cases, the menachos, the kmitza was not taken. So no kmitza was taken from these menachos, and what happens? They go ahead and they get mixed together. So essentially what you have is you have two menachos, right? Flour, oil, levona. And again, the two menachos get no kmitza taken from either. The two menachos get mixed together. So we'll say, what do you do now? If you're able to remove an individual kmitza from both of them, then it's kosher. Now again, I will say, the way Rashi understands this case over here, actually the way Gemara understands this case over here, is that halacha l'maisa, the way this is working is like this. You have mincha A and mincha B. They're getting mixed together. There's a part of those menachos that are mixed together, but each of them still have a part ultimately, again, that is separate. Right? So if you imagine, I guess the best way to imagine is you take mincha B, you pour them into a joint bowl. So that middle part is where they're both mixed together, but the two sides, they're still separate mincha. So essentially what the Mishnah says is like this. As long as there is enough of individual mincha A and enough of individual mincha B that you could reach into both of those and gather a kmitza from each, you're good to go. You're fine. However, if not, in other words, if the mixage is so much that you can't know for sure that you're getting an individual kmitza from A and from B, then the menachos are going to be pasul. That's the halacha. Shtei menachos shlo nikmitzu. So again, kmitza wasn't taken; they got mixed together. Im yochol likmotz mizu bifnei atzma. If you could take a kmitza from each of them on their own, then ultimately ksheros, then they'll be kosher. Vim lav psulos, but if not, they're going to be pasul. Kometz shenes arev b'mincha shelo nikmitza. Similarly, again, I will say if you have a kometz. Now again, I will say that's case one. Case two. I have a kmitza. So again, from mincha A, I actually have the kmitza. And what happens? The kmitza from mincha A gets mixed in with an unkamitzad mincha B. Right? So I have a regular mincha, the kmitza has not been removed from it. The kmitza from A gets mixed in with mincha B. Shalom nikmitza. So I'll say, what's halacha? Lo yaktir. You should not go ahead and offer up this mincha. Vim hiktir, and if you did offer up this combination, zu shenikmitza ola labailim, then the one that had the kmitza taken from it, i.e. mincha A, will work. And I will say, by the way, just so you appreciate this, see, to us, we're like, why? Why are we spending time on this? Like what? So just so you appreciate something. We'll say one of the most incredible things that we're going to get to see, like you think traffic in Yerushalayim is bad now? Just wait, right? Just wait in Yirtzeh Hashem until the Beis Hamikdash is built and watch what's going to happen. And it's not just going to be traffic. What must have been the frenetic pace in the Beis Hamikdash must have been something amazing to see, right? We have like this image that the Beis Hamikdash was like this picture of serenity. You go there like you're meditating, right? There's like guitars, there's kumsitzen, there's farbrengen, like it's great, right? It's like, listen, it must have been wild. Blood everywhere, right? Menachos and this one's yelling at this one, and this one's that, and quick, right? Quick, no, sir, and all this. Where did you put that? Now, obviously, there was a cedar, but just understand. There's one Beis Hamikdash for all of Klal Yisrael, which means that everybody's going to bring their karbanos there. So just so you could appreciate this, on any given moment, how many menachos must have been offered? Because remember, on both sides, you've got sota minchas. Hopefully not too many of those, right? But you've got sinners minchas, plenty of those, right? And then we've got minchas nesachim and minchas nedava. And again, all this stuff happening all the time. So now when you think about it from that context, first of all, it gives you such a smile on your neshama when you think about these cases. Because, right, you can look at this case in one of two ways. You can look at this case of like, why? My life is difficult enough. Why is there a need to go ahead and start talking about mixtures of menachos? Really? Is this happening? And the answer is, but Pashtos, yeah, probably this happened all the time. Cohen is going ahead and involved in a whole bunch of things. Where did I put the kmitza? The kmitza of this one, the kmitza of that one. And then when you begin to think about it in that context, that these mishnayos can reflect the frenetic pace of the Beis Hamikdash, you have only one reaction to it, which is a tremendous smile across your face and across your neshama, imagining, right? Imagine, I will say, just like imagine like Machane Yehuda on an Erev Shabbos, and just imagine that in the Beis Hamikdash every single day. Every single day. Right? Again, hopefully less pushing, right? But Lamaisa will say that's what it is. So now, when you look at it that way, so suddenly again the cases make a little bit more sense. So in case number one, right, I've got two unkamitzad menachos that get mixed in together. To which the Gemara says, no problem. As long as there's enough unmixed of mincha A and mincha B that you can take a kamitza of each, you're good to go. Case number two, a kamitza of mincha A, just the kamitza, gets mixed in with the unkamitzad mincha B. What do? So the Gemara Mishnah says, don't do anything with it. You really obviously should probably just burn it, not offer it, just burn it, discard it. However, if you did burn it, you did offer it up, so then ultimately the owner of mincha A, which is the owner of the kamitza, has fulfilled his obligation with the burning of that mincha. B'pashtas Rabosai, that is the shita that we saw of the Rabbanon on Mishnah Chav Beis Amud Aleph, which is Ein Olin Mevatlin Zu et Zu. When items that are supposed to be burnt on the Mizbeach kind of get burnt together, it works. It works. That seems to be bottom line with that sheet. There's both see more in the Gemara. Fine. The Gemara says, "V'im hikter good. V'im says, "Komish good. V'im hikter zushin ikspel olabaylim. V'zu shlonik misala olabaylim." But again, halacha l'maisa, those who go ahead and have the mincha B, chavra. Ultimately, again, they are not going to fulfill their obligation. Nis'arif kumsa b'shiyareha, or b'shiyareha shel chaverta. Here's another interesting case of both sides. Listen to this case. In this case over here, right, the kamitza of mincha A gets mixed in with its own shirayim. Remember, you're going to say, what is shirayim? Shirayim is the leftovers of the actual mincha itself. So here again, the kamitza of mincha A gets mixed in with the shirayim of mincha A, its own shirayim, or the shirayim of its fellow mincha, or mincha B, lo yaktir. Once again, don't burn that. Vim hiktir. But if you did, ola lebailim. Ultimately, again, it satisfies the obligation. So, you see a common denominator that when the kamitza of mincha A gets mixed in with another something, either an unkamitzad mincha B, the shirayim of mincha A, or the shirayim of mincha B, you shouldn't burn it. But if you did offer it, ultimately, the karban is effective. Incredible. Says the Gemara, Amar Rav Chisda. Rav Chisda says like this: Nevela betela b'shchuta. All right, so both say. So now we're going to get into a very interesting story. Rav Chisda says like this: Nevela is batal b'shchuta. So if you both say nevela meat means meat that died or didn't have a proper slaughter. Right? Any time you have an animal that either didn't have a proper shchita, died of its own occurrences, or died with a manner not by shchita, that's called nevela. Now again, it's important to remember over here, when we think about nevela, we just think about it's not kosher. But there's another component over here, which is nevela conveys tumah. Nevela conveys tumah. So now the Gemara says like this: if you have nevela meat that got mixed in ultimately again with shchita, with properly slaughtered meat, Ultimately, again, Rav Chisda says, nevela is batal in shchuta. Why? Because slaughtered meat can never become nevela meat. Now, what does that mean? Take a look at Rashi. Nevela betela b'shchuta, im yesh shtei chatichos, achas shchuta v'achas nevela. Right? If you have two pieces of meat, one is shchuta, one is nevela, ve'ein yadua ezu, and right, I don't know obviously which one is which. So the Gemara says, betela bahem shimnaga ba'achas mechatichos, eino tameh da'aminan shchutahi. So I'll say, so again, in this case over here, I have two pieces of shchuta meat that gets mixed in with one piece of nevela meat. I don't know which is which. So what the Gemara says over here, if Chisda says, is that halacha l'maisa, the nevela is batal in the shchuta. The nevela is batal. Now, why is it batal? Now, again, at first glance, this would seem to be what we call a case of min b'mino, right? Like items that are combined with each other. So and we say min b'mino is not batal. Rabbi Chisda says they're not similar items. Why? Because status-wise, one can never become the other. Shchuta meat can never become nevela meat. That's not status-wise, categorically, that cannot happen. Because of that, ultimately, again, the nevela can become batal in the shchuta. Rashi says, therefore, min b'she'eno mino ubatal divrei hakol. Then you will say, the halacha is, especially going to see this in Smichas Chaver, when you have two dissimilar items, min b'she'eno mino, so that is batal. That could create bittul, dissimilar items. With similar items, there's a shayla about whether or not to become batal or not. But again, Rav Chisda is saying like this, even though all the pieces of meat look the same, but because categorically, a piece of nevela meat can never become shchuta meat, or a piece of shchuta meat can never become nevela meat. I should say differently. A piece of shchuta meat can never become nevela meat. Therefore, it's min b'she'eno mino. It's two dissimilar items, and therefore, again, the nevela can become batal in the shchuta. Incredible. U'shchuta ain't a betela b'nevela, and ultimately, again, a shchuta can't become batal in nevela. Why? She'afshar shenevela she'asa shchuta. This is very interesting. However, if you have, let's say, two pieces of nevela meat, right? Two pieces of nevela meat and one piece of shchuta meat, ultimately, again, the shchuta can't become batal in the nevela. Why? She'afshar nevela she'asa shchuta. Because, listen to this, shchuta can't become nevela, right? That can't happen. But a nevela can become shchuta. Not that you could eat it, but it no longer conveys tumah. How does that happen? This is fascinating. If you have a piece of nevela meat, once the meat becomes rancid, once it becomes putrid, right, and no longer edible even by a dog, it loses its nevela status. Loses nevela status, and therefore, again, does not convey tumah. Fascinating. Rabbi Chanina says, Kol she'afshar lo liyos kamo eno batal. V'chol she'afshar lo liyos kamo batal. So this is fascinating. Rabbi Chanina says, here's the rule. Anytime that in the mixture, one item can become categorically like the other, then it can't become batal. Which again, Abba says, another way of saying, when one item can become like another, that's called min b'mino. Two similar items mixed together, and two similar items mixed together cannot become batal. However, anything that cannot become like its mixed counterpart, ultimately can become batal, because that's called min b'she'eno mino, two dissimilar items. So the Gemara says, okay, aliba deman. Whose opinion does this reflect? If it's going to the Rabbanon, ha'amri olinu d'lo mevati adadi avam mimamino batal. Both say the Rabbanon say ultimately again that it's only items that are offered up on the mizbech together that are not mevatel each other. But min b'mino, even two similar items can be mevatel each other. And if it's going to Rabbi Yehuda, you're going to both say this is referencing our machlokes on Chaf Beis. If Rabbi Yehuda, the Gemara says. Vaha, if it comes to Rabbi Yehuda, Vaha, Amud Beis, Vaha, Rabbi Yehuda, Basar Chazusa Azil. Remember again, I both say Rabbi Yehuda holds that halacha l'maisa. When you have a mixture, what do we look at? We look at the optics. We look at the what's the word? Not the image. The appearance. Thank you. We look at the appearance. Remember again, I both say this is yesterday's daf. This was the blood mixed with the wine. So according to Rabbi Yehuda, we look at appearance. V'idi min b'mino. If that's the case, based on appearance, all these pieces of meat look the same, and therefore halacha l'maisa should be min b'mino. If it's min b'mino, then it's ultimately not going to be batal. Ella alibad Rabbi Chia. Rather, Rabbi say this is going according to Rabbi Chia. What does Rabbi Chia say? The Tani Rabbi Chia, nevela ushchuta betelos zubezu. Listen to this. Rabbi Chia says, when you have nevela and shchuta, so again, nevela meat mixed with shchuta meat, ultimately, again, they are batal. They are batal one and the other. Now, Rabbi saying, again, just understand the impact of that statement. If we say that they're batal, what does that tell you? What does that tell you? That it is min b'she'ino mino. It is two dissimilar items. Now, why would nevela and shchuta be two dissimilar items? Very simple, because shchuta can never become nevela. Right? Properly shechted meat can never. Now, what does it mean? Properly shechted meat can never become nevela. Properly shechted meat can never convey tumah. It doesn't. You can't do that. Something that is tar cannot be. I should say can't become tameh, but it's not true. But again, in the case of meat, a piece of shchuta meat can never become nevela. So because that Rabbi Chia holds that halacha l'maisa. Now again, remember the converse is not true. Nevela can become shchuta, as we just saw. How does nevela become shchuta? If it putrefies, right? If it becomes so just putrefied that even a dog wouldn't eat it, it loses its status as nevela. So it's Rabbi Chia who holds that when you have shchuta meat and nevela meat, that's min b'she'eno mino. They are separate items, and therefore halacha l'maisa, they can be mavatal one. They can be mavatal each other. So Rabbi Chia libedeman, whose opinions Rabbi Chia reflect? If it's the Rabbanon, ha'amri olin hudol mevatli adadi hamin b'mino batal. Remember again, if it's the Rabbanon really don't focus on this min b'mino, right? The Rabbanon hold that halacha l'maisa, items that are brought up on the mizbeach with each other aren't mevatel each other, but everything else can be mevatel each other. If that's the case, then even shchuta with nevela should be mevatel each other. Rabbi Yehuda, and Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Chaf Gimel Amud Beis 23b, 6 lines down. Rabbi Yehuda, Kol min b'mino, Rabbi Yehuda lo batal. According to Rabbi Yehuda, min b'mino in general is not batal, right? It's not batal. So what's going on over here? In reality, Rabbi Chia's statement is made in accordance with Rabbi Yehuda. And when did Rabbi Yehuda say that like items are not batal? Hani mili hecha de efshal mehave kavase. When do we say min b'mino is not batal? That's when the items literally have the ability and capacity to become like each other. To become like each other. Aval hecha de lo efshar, aval hecha de lo efshal mehave kavase batal. But when they can't become each other, like each other, what's a good example of when they can't become like each other? What's a good example of that? Shchuta meat with nevela meat. Why? Because shchuta can never become nevela. Shchuta can never become nevela. And I'll say, this is very interesting. Here's the machlokes. Rav Chisda holds, basar mevatel as linon. Rav Chisda holds, Rabbi say, now here's what's interesting. What do we use to kind of gauge, or what do we use to determine the identity of this mixture? Rav Chisda says we look at the mavatal, the item that is causing the nullification, which I will say by definition means the item that is in greater concentration, right? So the greater concentration item, that's what we look at. We look at basar mavatal as linon. So we'll say, so halacha l'maisa, we say, can the larger amount attain the status of the smaller amount? If the answer to that ultimately, again, is yes, then that's called min b'mino. If it's min b'mino, then ultimately, again, it's not going to be batal. If, however, the mavata, the larger amount, cannot attain the status of the smaller amount, that's going to be min b'she'eno mino, and therefore, again, can affect bitol. The Gemara says, we look at the mavatal. Mavatal is just another way of saying the mavatal is the item that is going to cause the nullification, which by definition means the item in greater concentration. Rabbi Chanina says, basar batal aslinon. No, we look at the smaller item in the smaller amount, and we look at can that smaller amount item ultimately, again, assume the identity of the larger amount. So, okay, let's plug that in. Tanan. Shtei menachos, we'll say now the Gemara quotes our Mishnah. Shtei menachos, shelo nikmitzu, v'nis arvu zubazu. So this is our Mishnah. You have two menachos, mincha A, mincha B. Kmitza was not taken from either of them. V'nis arvu zubazu, then they were mixed together. Im yachol likmos mizeh b'fnei atzmo, u'mizeh b'fnei atzmo ksheros, v'im lav psulos. So if there is enough unmixed mincha A, and enough unmixed mincha B to be able to take a kamitza from each, then you're good to go. And if not, both of the menachos will be pasul. I v'ha kevan the comments lemichada ida chavili shirayim. But 1 second, I don't understand. In this case over here, once you take a kamitza from one of them, doesn't the other one by definition become shirayim? V'lo kamavat l'shirayim l'tivla, and ultimately again, won't the shirayim ultimately again v'lo kamavat l'shirayim l'tivla, and won't the shirayim go ahead and technically be mavat l'tivla? Tevel in this context means over here, tevel means the mincha that did not have the kamitza removed. So once you go ahead and you take the kamitza from one of them, ultimately, again, don't the shirayim of that mincha then have the ability to be mavatal, ultimately, again, the unkamitzad other mincha, to which the Gemara says, money. Whose opinion is that? If it's the Rabbanan only say that it's items offered up on the Mizbeach that are not mavatal each other, ha min bamino batal. But ultimately, again, min bamino is going to be batal. El pshita Rabbi Huda. Rather, again, it must be Rabbi Huda. Bishta lamanda amar basal basar batal azlinon. So according to the opinion that says, which is Rabbi Chanina, that you hold basar batal azlinon, that we look at the item in smaller measure, and that's what determines. And we look, can that smaller item assume the identity of the larger item? Then ultimately, again, lamanda amar basar batal azlinon, batal havi kimevatal. Ultimately, again, then the item in smaller measure can become like the item in larger measure. The lechid kamis midach havelu shirayim kihani. Because ultimately, again, when you end up taking the kamitza from mincha B, then the shirayim of mincha B will be like the shirayim of mincha A. But according to the opinion that says that we look after the mavatal, the item in larger measure, then ultimately, again, can the shirayim ever become tevel? The answer to that is no. Lema delo Rabbi Chia. So rather, it must be that it's not reflecting the view of Rabbi Chia, to which the Gemara says, Hasam kid Rabbi Zera. Perhaps it's reflecting the view of Rabbi Zera. What does Rabbi Zera say? Rabbi Zera is very interesting. It says you have to burn the komets, and it says you have to burn the shirayim. Just like I will say by the burning of the komets, we see that one komets can't be mevatl another komets. Af haktara ha'amura b'shirayim ain't shirayim mevatl as hakomets. So too, when it talks about burning the shirayim ultimately again can't be mevatl the komets. Okay, so everyone will say the Gemara is suggesting it's not Rabbi Chia at all, it's Rabbi Zera. Fine. So we're back to Gemara tries again. Tashma. HaKomet shenis ay b'mincha shalonik mitzah. So I'll say another quote to the Mishnah. So a komets, right? So I have a komets from mincha A that gets mixed in with another mincha B, from which the komets has not been removed. So what's talacha? Lo yaktir. You should not burn the mixture. Vim hektir, but if you did burn it, zu shenik mitzah al salabailim. So the komets A, where the kmitza was taken from, that ultimately satisfies the owner's obligation. V'zu shalonik mitzah lo al salabailim. But unkometz mincha B, ultimately, again, will not satisfy the owner's obligation. So Gemara says, 1 second, V'lo kamevatale tivla lekomets, but ultimately, again, doesn't the teva, which is the unkometz mincha, isn't that mevatal the kamitza of mincha A? To which the Gemara says, well, whose opinion? Money. Same thing. If it's Rabbanan, it's only the Rabbanan hold min b'minos batal. It's only, again, items offered up on the Mizbeach together that are not mevatal each other. Ella, pshita Rabbi Huda. Rather, again, it must be Rabbi Yehuda. So, according to the opinion that says that we go after the mevatel, the larger measure item, to see if it can become like the smaller measure item, then ultimately, again, mevatel have kibatel. In this case, the mevatel can become like the batal. How so? Because every amount can technically be used for the kmitza. If that's the case, ultimately, again, that is min bamino. Min bamino lo batal, and like items in a mixture, ultimately are not batal. But according to the opinion that says that we go after, ultimately, again, the batal, the smaller measure item, then ultimately, komets miyavi tivla. Can the kamitza of mincha A ever become like the unkamitzad material of mincha B? Of course not. Lema dlok Rabbi Chia. So must not be like Rabbi Chia. To which the Gemara says, Hanami kid Rabbi Zera, ultimately, again, this must again reflect the view of Rabbi Zera. We'll have to stop over for today. I know we went fast in this last sugya, but just to understand, interestingly enough, what the Mishnah is just doing is taking all the cases of the Mishnah of Kamitzos and Menachos getting mixed into each other and broadening the discussion about the halachos of min b'mino, min b'she'eno mino. What's the definition of like items, dissimilar items? I promise clarity and resolution and a tremendous feeling of spiritual enlightenment. Emir Hashem tomorrow. Shkoyach. All right, have a great day, everyone. You want to announce, Resnick? You want to announce?
The Shiva House, if anyone wants to attend, it's up to you. Shiva House for Resnick, it's at 7804